I think I'm Luisa Gomez, and I'm with the Comité por el Voto Latino, which is part of La Liga de las Mujeres Votantes, so the League of Women Voters. And I'm so glad that all of you are here today. In a very short amount of time, we're going to have a wonderful speaker who has graciously given up his time, energy, and research time and energy to share with us what is really important is to really better understand the statistics as it relates to the data about how Latinos and others on the South Side are voting. I was, Jamie is familiar with, and Diane knows that some of us have been involved with the Latino vote since 70s and 80s. And even back then, we knew that the turnout was always on the lower side compared to citywide. So we're going to get a snapshot through John's assistance to more recent times in terms of voter turnout. And this has got to help us better plan and be strategic in terms of our outreach in the Latino community. Because all of us are working on the Latino vote and the South Side vote, which is not just the Latino vote. Because we're seeing the South Side. It's always had a multiracial flavor to it, but even more so, the African American community is here with us on the South Side. The Southeast Asian community is here with us too, and so we really have to, for the voters of the past and the voters of today and our voters for the future, we really have to do our best outreach to serve people. So in trying to do that, we all have our respective strategies. All of them are good. All of them need to happen. And so perhaps with this information, we're going to learn something a little bit new about how our strategy can be strengthened in our outreach. So with that, what I would like to do is ask John to make his presentation. And then after that, and John, what's the length of the presentation?
Maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, so for about 15, 20 minutes, it would possibly be helpful to just kind of go through it, and then we can go back and really ask a lot of the heavy-duty questions. I think that are on the table. I mean, all of us in our pockets have a lot of questions we have for you.
Sounds great.
Great. So with that, let me turn this over to John, and let's give a round of applause for this.
You know, as I was getting ready for this, I was trying to think of the first time I ever encountered the league. And I think it was when I was in undergrad at a table at the Western Illinois University Student Union register people to vote. So it was a good first impression. I've been impressed by what the league does here in Milwaukee. So it's an honor to speak to you all. So today we're talking about the near South Side, which in consultation with Eloisa, we're limiting to just the 8th and 12th aldermanic districts, which covers the 42 wards you see here. Now you'll notice that one of those wards is huge and leads all the way up to the expressway. We don't really think of that as the South Side, but nobody lives up there. It's just that every part of the city has to be part of some ward. That's the word they put it in, but the populated portion of it, talking about this one right here, is all in really like the Clark Square neighborhood. So anyway, these 42 wards contain about 55,000 adults from the 2020 census. 2/3 of those are Hispanic or Latino. About 1/5 are white, 8% are Black, and 4% are Asian. It's 2/3 Latino, 67%, 19% white, 8% Black, 4% Asian. And the rest are people of different race or for convenience, throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to neighborhoods so we can talk about variations within the South Side. The boundaries you see here are not the exact boundaries you can see from the city or Google Maps, but I've just combined the words into something that approximates that. So I apologize if these are not your preferred boundaries, but I think they're pretty close. And then on the left here, I show the proportion of each ward who is Latino. And as you can see, as I'm sure you know from your own experience, it varies around in your south side. The Latino population is really concentrated in the center of that area. It's 70% or more in Lincoln Village, Mosquito Way, Mitchell Street. The white population is the largest at the two corners, the northeast corner and the southwest corner. So that's the sort of gentrified Walker's Point ward in the upper corner, and then the getting on towards Jackson Park neighborhood on the bottom corner. It's the boundary on the south side. It's really the railroad tracks where you see that difference. The Black population is largest in Clark Square, where it's 17% of the population, and it's second, it's 10% in Mitchell Street. Oh, I'll add to that Walker's Point. The version of it that you see here is 33% white, and Layton Park is 34% white. Then the Asian population is scattered around the entire south side. If it's concentrated anywhere, it would be Silver City, where it makes up 5% of the population. Now, there are different ways of measuring turnout, and you'll hear people tell different stories about turnout being up or down or flat, depending on which way they're measuring it. This gets kind of wonky, but I figured you're the League of Women Voters, that's fine with you. So I'm going to spend some time going through this in some detail. If the best way to measure turnout, if it were possible, would be the share of eligible voters who cast a ballot. But we don't know how many eligible voters there are, especially at smaller geographies. You see estimates statewide, but it's very difficult to get it for a small area, basically impossible. And so people often use adults as their denominator. Well, what's the share of ballots cast as the share of adults? But obviously that doesn't really work, especially if you're looking at trends around places like Milwaukee, because there's a lot of people who are disenfranchised due to felony convictions or have never been eligible to vote due to their citizenship status. So you can look at voter turnout as a share of registered voters, which is what I usually end up doing. But the share of adults who are registered to vote significantly around the city. So really the only solution is to think about all of those numbers at the same time, if possible. So let's begin with the south side. When I say south side for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to mean those 42 wards, 55,000 adults that we just talked about. So the adult population on the south side has stayed basically the same over the last 8 years. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to the 2022, 2018, and 2014 elections because they're all gubernatorial elections, presidential election have their own thing going on, but we can keep a consistent comparison point with these midterm elections. So across that period, the adult population on the south side stays basically the same. I'm getting these numbers from the census and interpolating them for the between census years. And the number of registered voters also stays basically the same at about 25,000. So a little under half of the adults on the south side are registered to vote. Of course, the number of, there's a sort of unknown proportion of adults on the south side who would be eligible to vote. But regardless of whatever that number is, the number of actual registered voters on the south side has stayed about the same. The number of ballots actually cast was 12,500 in 2014, 15,500 in 2018, and 11,500 in 2022. 2018 was a pretty anomalous election year. People were very energized to go vote in Milwaukee and around Wisconsin and really around the whole country. So I discourage people from making too much of a comparison to 2018 because that was a special year. That was maybe the highest midterm turnout, in my lifetime. 2014 is maybe a better comparison because it was a similar non-Trumpy, I guess we'll say, midterm election. And so what we see is that the number of votes cast relative to 2014 did fall on the south side by about 8%. Now, if we look at the rest of the city, likewise, the adult population has stayed the same over this period, 378,000. But this is an important point. The number of registered voters has fallen considerably. So it's 307,000 in 2014, 287,000 in 2018, and just 268,000 in 2022. So in the rest of the city, we have the same number of adults, to the best of our knowledge, and the proportion of those adults who are registered to vote has fallen. Now, if we look at the next column, which has the number of votes cast in the rest of the city, we got 196,000 in 2014. That bumps up a little bit, 201,000 in 2018. And then it falls all the way to 168,000 in 2022. So a 14% fewer ballots cast in 2022 versus 2014. So a larger drop, pretty considerably larger drop than happened on the south side. And now you'll see that when we look at turnout as a share of registered voters or a share of adults, you see two different trends, because even though voters have fallen a lot in the rest of the city, so have registered voters, which makes it look like turnout is about the same as 2014, when in reality, a much lower share of people in the city cast a ballot. And so a simple way of thinking about this is that the South Side has seen a lot of stability over the last 8 years in the number of adults who are registered to vote and the number who are actually showing up and voting. It's been pretty stable on the South Side, and it's been falling in the rest of the city. So as you all know, the baseline level of voter participation on the South Side is much lower than the rest of the city, but the trend is better. The trend is more or less flat versus pretty negative in the rest of the city. So make of that what you will, and be curious to hear your thoughts. All right, so here are some maps that show this at the ward level. You may be thinking, how are you mapping ward level vote changes because the ward boundaries changed after the 2022 redistricting? That's a good point. So what I've done is taken the adult population overlap between the old ward boundaries and the new ones using census blocks, and then allocated the votes from the old boundaries into the new wards for the purposes of these comparisons with 2018 and 2014. That means that the figures, there's a little bit of uncertainty around them, but it's really pretty accurate. And for purposes of an analysis like this, it works quite nicely. So in the first map that you see right here, this is turnout as a share of registered voters in every ward in the city in 2022 in the November election. And you can see, lowest turnout is here on the south side, and the highest turnout is, here's the shift since 2018. And you see that this turnout as a share of registered voters is greatest on parts of the south side, but the decline really is just about everywhere in the city. In fact, there's only a handful of wards where turnout actually increased, and those are like what I think of as kind of the like professional parts of the cities, looking downtown, the towers are, a little bit in Bayview. And then the one that I think is particularly interesting is the shift since 2014, right? 2018 is kind of an anomalous year. We're not entirely sure what to make of it. That was time on. And so here we see a little bit different trend. So the south side, turnout as a share of registered voters declined a little bit, but not as much as on most of the north side. And we actually see increases in turnout as a share of registered voters, mostly in, again, those kind of white professional parts of the city, the Upper East Side, downtown, a little bit Washington Heights, Bayview. And then there's kind of a wash on the far southwest side. Let's look at turnout in the specific neighborhoods on the near south side. So turnout lagged the citywide, or the rest of the city figure in every neighborhood on the south side. It was highest in Walker's Point and lowest in Muskego Way, where 40% of registered voters cast a vote. The declines follow a kind of similar pattern, where the greatest decreases relative to, say, 2014 or 2018 come in Layton, Muskego Way, those kinds of neighborhoods. The smallest decrease comes in Walker's Point, where turnout actually increased quite a lot relative to 2014. Kind of interesting. 2014 up to 2/3 in 2018, just under 60% this past year. But if you go back to these ward maps, you can see that Walker's Point really has wildly divergent things happening right next door. It's hard to see on this map, but you have this green ward, which is the one in the far corner of it, where the most gentrification has happened. And then in the sort of more still Latino and poorer neighborhoods, you see the opposite thing happening. So I think Walker's Point is, to the extent that a neighborhood is trying to describe parts of the city that are similar, these boundaries of Walker's Point, I don't think of that before. Kind of two different things going on there. This is a way of showing the same data with a scatter plot. And so on the x-axis, we got the share of adults who are Hispanic or Latino in each ward. Then on the y-axis, we have the share of registered voters who cast vote in that ward. And as you can see, voter turnout declines pretty consistently as the Latino share of adults in a ward increases. And if anything, that relationship became even steeper and starker in 2022. So the relationship has been there for quite a long time. Right. Last thing I looked at, I had fun with this, was seeing where in the city different ways of voting are most popular. And there are some pretty striking regional trends, maybe more than I would have thought of. So please notice that the color scales are different on each of these maps. That's so that you can highlight the variations within each map the most, but please don't like compare the colors between the three of them. So if we look at election day registration first, that is just far and away the most popular on college campuses. This color scale goes all the way up to like 80%. That is how kids at UWM Marquette voted in 2022. They registered on election day. Then if we look at voting early by mail, this happens everywhere. This scale goes up to about 40% is the darkest color. This happens everywhere, but if anything, you can tell that it is most popular in those kind of majority white areas along the lake. So I would say this is most popular with like higher income voters. And then early in person, again, happens everywhere, but people are really the most into it on the north side. Now, I want to caution that since this color scale is taking up so much space, 0 to 80 instead of 0 to 30, if we were to rescale it, you would see that there is still quite a lot of election day registration happening around the city. It's just nowhere close to the really large proportion that happens by these college campuses. Great, and here's how vote moves play out on the near south side. So on the south side in total, we see that 15% of votes were cast by election day registers in 2022. 14% of votes were cast absentee by mail, and 12% early in person. So registering on election day and voting that way is a little bit more popular on the south side than it is in the rest of the city overall. That is something that is commonly used by voters in this part of the city. But voting early, whether by mail or in person, is significantly less common. That is true in every neighborhood on the south side. So combined in the rest of the city, 35% of voters voted early in one of those two ways. 35%, pretty considerable. But on the south side, just 26% did. And that was as low as 20% in Clark Square and Silver City, 23% in Muskego Way. And that is, again, in 2022, we've seen a big increase in the rest of the city in those kinds of alternative ways of voting over the last 2 years. But even after that increase, we're still at this about a quarter of voters on the south side voting early versus more than 2/3 in the rest of the city. So to sum all of this up, as you all know, turnout is really kind of abysmally low on the south side, but the share of adults who are registered and the share of adults who are voting has remained much more stable on the south side over the last 8 years than it has in the rest of the city where it's been falling. So positive trend there. And then I think a really important point is that the south side lags the rest of the city in early voting by a higher mode. So if you were looking for a way to increase turnout on the south side, that might be a place to begin considering some strategies, because voters in the rest of the city find that to be a successful way to vote. Although I think it's worth pointing out again that the south side does have higher same-day registration than the rest of the city. So that is a method of voting that is put to good use in these wards. All right, I'll end it there. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. As you'll notice, I've scrupulously avoided any discussion of partisan voting trends. But if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Do you have data on how frequently people change their address in the different neighborhoods?
I think the closest we can get to that is the share who are, and it's, you know, because that's a proxy for how frequently you move.
Yeah.
And that is pretty high on the south side, but it's also high on a lot of parts of the north side. So it's not a perfectly clear connection. I think you easily get access to a voter file. They haven't started messing around with it yet. Good question.
We started with you in 2014 with the gubernatorial election.
Yeah.
We know that the number of registered voters in the city over
Yeah.
Was there a carry? For those years, those years, the Obama elections generate more registered voters. There was 2014 sort of a carryover from a higher number of registered voters that had to do with the presidential elections.
Well, in some sense, I think that's true. Yeah, because 2008, especially, but it was very well that you're saying, but particularly high participation years in the city. On the other hand, you know, like, is that an anomaly or is that just sort of because it happened 2 years in a row. So I'm okay with saying that, like, yeah, maybe turnout shouldn't be that high. But it is quite well.
I mean, it could have been an anomaly just for those two.
Yeah. This is running the thing that political scientists always have, or anytime anybody makes a theory about presidential, your sample size is large enough. We haven't had enough. Oh, yeah.
I am interested in if you want to talk a little bit about how the Latino vote is divided by
Yeah.
parts.
Right. This is something I've spent some time trying to understand in Milwaukee. It, of course, is complicated by the fact that we don't have, you know, when people register to vote, they don't indicate their race or ethnicity. So there's some uncertainty of what the mix of the voters in a ward are compared to the adults who live there. That being said, long story short, it seems pretty clear that Donald Trump did better in 2016 among Latino voters in Milwaukee than Obama did in 2012, and that Trump in 2020 did better than Trump in 2016, but that Republicans have not benefited from that writ large. So Walker did very poorly in 2018 in majority Latino wards, and there was not really any change at all correlated with the number of Latino voters in 2022. So the Trump being somewhat more popular with Latino voters is consistent with what we've seen around the country, but also kind of consistent with what we've seen around the country. That didn't really seem to play out in the way that Republicans were hoping in 2020.
Any particular reason why the according to the census why people don't vote?
Like in the rest of the city, especially.
Yeah, and the Latinos. I'm
Yeah.
asking because I hear a lot saying that, especially with a lot of things that
Yeah, safe, but also about sports. People are, I am aware a little bit about the polls that the rest of the people are gonna. And then, they announced that, this person is ahead of others. And people say, how do they know that? They didn't ask me. And the majority of the people, especially in the south side, and that's why I'm saying this colors people.
Yeah.
Vote people. That's why, how do we change that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I can say a little bit about opinion polling, since I do a little bit of that work. And, you're right, response rates are terrible. It's very difficult to just pick up the phone, which is how we still do it. Stop it. Like 1%. Which makes it very expensive, and it makes it less accurate. Potentially, if you're not able to understand the ways in which certain kinds of voters are being less likely to respond. You know, we know people who likely to answer the phone, people with more education, are more likely to answer the phone, those kinds of things, and we can wait to accommodate for that. But I think you're right that confidence has fallen in polling largely because and I think there's a broader thing going on. I don't want to get out over my skis here, but consistently across all of these maps, and if we did this for presidential years, you'd see that too. Turnout has increased the most in these parts of the city that are most highly educated and most high income, and in Milwaukee, the most white. And it's clear that whatever the sort of political scene is doing right now is most popular with those voters. You know, it is energizing to show up and vote. And then there's other parts of the city that are less white and will have less college education and less income. Whatever the parties are doing is much less compelling. You see lower voting.
Question. Do you have these numbers by age breakdown?
Check it.
Excuse me, but what?
Age.
I actually think I might be able to now though, because we got a whole new voter file, which has the history of if people voted or not. And it does have the age. So that's the kind of thing that you can't do with like free public data. But I think we might be able to in the future with this new data set we have. It's a great question.
Because that might be able to tell us, do elders vote mostly by mail
Yes.
and maybe young people in person,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
that could help us in our planning somewhat.
Yeah. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about this thing where voter registration has stayed more stable on the south side. Is that surprising to any of you that we have like if you adjust it for what's happening in the rest of the city, really a positive thing happening in voter turnout? That what you expected, kind of consistent with your observation?
I can speak to, I'll speak from Scott's perspective.
Yeah.
Civic engagement efforts on the south side, and I'll speak for my organization, were exponentially increased. And so I came to the agency in 2015 and 2016. We passed the policy that civic engagement was a critical foundational strategy.
Yeah.
In SIV that keeps happening, and we piloted civic engagement for 2 years and then fully launched a full department in 2020. And so at least for SOC's footprint, it's half of what we do now. For instance, in 2020, we did 70,000 outreach attempts. We beat the national average in pickup on phone and text. And so VOCs is still doing civic engagement. They were moving more to C4, so we sort of said, okay, we'll pick up 3. And so, you know, there's an exponentially larger amount of work happening than there ever has been.
Yeah.
And we continue to increase that. And then what I wanted to, just ask a question. So I'm not surprised, because of what I know, just us, and
Right.
I would dare to say we're probably the largest civic engagement game on the south side, not necessarily. Maybe most of them, sometimes depending on what they're doing, their C4, you know what I mean? And so I'm not, surprised. I was intending, we've been watching the numbers really carefully. And there's some really huge victories that don't show up in this kind of.
Yeah.
And the 2022 is actually a massive victory post-pandemic.
Yeah.
Just to actually stay stable after a pandemic is a massive. And when you think of the anti-immigrant sentiment and the messages sent during the 2 prior presidential races of like, don't even, you get picked up, and et cetera, and then sort of Captain Rouse, when he became chief, regressing on his policy about SB 130, not cooperating with ICE. So when you consider all those things, like 2020 is like a massive victory. I do have a question.
Yeah.
The boundaries you're using for neighborhoods are based on whose boundaries?
So what,
Because like the city has
right, so,
each neighborhood sort of self-identifies.
yeah, so what I did is I looked at those city boundaries,
Yeah,
and I didn't want to split any of the words up, because then
that makes it difficult.
for calculating the numbers, but don't put too much stock in.
Yeah, no, because I would tell you, like, there's some natural configurations that are not represented here. For instance, when you look at the Walker's Point area, Walker's Point technically, historically has been that district,
Right.
but at least 20, 25 years ago, it is distinctly Walker Square neighborhood and Walker's Point. And I bet you, if you slice that on 6 or 8, whatever street you want to, Walker's Point's output is going to be very different than Walker Square. And then Clark Square, not to say if anybody's here like really representing Clark Square, like Clark Square practically is like, this is the south side, like this is Clark Square.
Yeah,
It's blocks.
yeah.
And so,
I do want to say that, like, this whole portion of this, no one lives there.
yeah,
So,
I'm just a little sensitive
yeah.
about the reality of what Clark Square, not because I happen to live on the boulevard, so I mean, shared membership in Clark Square and what would be formerly Layton Boulevard West. But if you really slice that map, you see where Silver City is?
Yeah.
If you take that north and blue, go up, and then if you want to count Mitchell Park, if you do have some residents there, I hope they're voting. So I just want to, like, when I'm a south side and I look at that, I want to be able to relate to it. And I would say that Walker's Point would be divided a little more than in the middle, and then Clark Square's footprint would be about as big as maybe Silver City.
Yeah.
Just because then you could say those are distinct natural geographic, not by ward, because I have the same problem.
Yeah.
Running data, it's like the wards don't match up with it.
Right. No,
That's just, some observations about them.
yeah, I appreciate that. One, I just like to make a comment about your initial point, which is, I think it is really factual. Like, I think some people, especially from the outside, who don't know a lot about Milwaukee, when they look at the voter trends, they say, well, there hasn't been any change. Nobody must be different. But the point I really wanted to make by comparing what's happened in this set of wards with what's happened in the rest of the city is that the current was going in the wrong direction, sitting declining. So appearing to tread water, appearing to stay in place is as you said, a massive difference from the sort of what we'd imagine the counterfaction would be.
Yeah, and if you go back several years, the trends is different. So we've made headway on the south side if you go back further.
Yeah.
It's just that, well, the politics in recent history are what they are.
Don, can you show correlation between home ownership and voter turnout?
Yeah, this is something I'm planning to do more detailed project on in the future. But it is very much true. It's one of the most established findings in the political science literature that homeowners are way more likely to, especially non-residential.
Because that's part of what, because, Kevin is representing via, which is the Silver City. And, I think that wherever you find the hubs, even in the Muskego Way where there's some concentration of work is, in Muskego Way, you can find some clusters of stronger homeownership and other clusters of high rentership. And it just feels that the turnouts, if you were to map over that, the home ownership rates, especially where there's a cluster, you'll see the relationship of higher or turnout. So,
Yeah.
and so I think, without, creating some kind of, two separate kinds of, I don't know then how do you reach renters, because when you're doing door to door, you can't get in most of the, a lot of the buildings to do the, direct engagement. So I kind of would love to figure out what are effective strategies for reaching renters. And I don't want to like solidly categorize
Yeah.
homeowners and renters. On the other hand, I think we're always looking for strategies of reach people effectively on very limited budgets, because I know all of us have super limited budgets. So what are, what can we do? If that would be, if you were to kind of put it into categories of ranking high or low, is age the kind of key factor of who votes? Is it home ownership following the second ranking? How do we, in terms of our non-partisan voter work outreach work, gonna help us be strategic enough?
Yeah, because are you thinking that you want to target people who are least likely to vote? Well, homeowners are probably going to figure out on their,
I think they need less help.
Yeah,
I
less
really think they need
Yeah.
less help
Yeah.
to navigate. And I do
Right.
feel that it is a factor of navigating how do you vote?
Yeah,
Where do you get the information if you're non-Spanish, English speaking, limited English speaking, the resources are less there for you.
and that's why I was wondering when I looked at this data, I was really struck by how uncommon voting early was in these wards. And I wonder if that has something, I think knowing that you can vote early makes it easier for some people to vote because, they can sit down and figure out which schedule. It's not just like random Tuesday where all the ducks have to be in a row for them. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think, I'm sure people have some views on that. I mean, one of the things we've been a poll worker for the last 8 years, is that younger people are, like you said, I can tell you, I could have told you the bulk of college student voting and it's age.
Yeah.
It's college student, but it's age too.
Yeah.
Pretty much, most of the time being at the polls and I work second shift. So right before 8 o'clock, if there's somebody who's gonna come and register to vote, it's likely gonna be a younger person. And I'm so puzzled by that concept. It's like, you can do so much online. The younger people know that they can do all this online and yet they show up, to vote the day of. So that is just seems mind-boggling to me. However, I do think usually there's only two spots on the south side to vote early. And that's.
I bet you.
And that is, and it's a budgetary issue for the city, they can't, and where somebody will open their doors for that 2-week period. But yet I do feel like if we had more places for people to vote early. Since we don't have the lock boxes in where we can put in our ballots, I do think that could make a difference.
Yeah.
I don't know, if there's been some other experiences for people.
I'll comment a little bit on some of the things, Lisa brought up. You're right, they're not, even this election, there's just weather all libraries. The north side has that midtown, the old Capitol Court shopping mall. People know where it is, and it's very, very popular for early voting. There's nothing comparable on the south side. I don't know what that would look like, but I think it could be done a lot better. My group, Supermarket Legends, was called that because we actually did start out and COVID kind of messed us up, but just standing out in front of supermarkets, talking to people, giving them just the really basic information. This is where you get registered to vote. Handing out hundreds of thousands of early voting schedules. People don't want to be told you can vote early or you should vote early. They want to know when and where they can do this, right? People are not stupid and they know they should be treated that way, but this information is not easy to find. And so I know my group, we pay lots and lots of money to make early voting schedules to hand out all over the city. And like for this election, I have one in that's bilingual English, Spanish. The city, last time I checked anyway, did not have a Spanish version on their website. And they expect you to go and use Google Translator. Well, I'm sure you're all aware of the problems with Google Translate. It's not adequate to the task. So I would say if you're going to be strategic, go where people are. Everybody has to eat, right? So go where people buy their food. And, the chain supermarkets are not going to let you anywhere near the place. But the locally owned ones will let you stand there. And we're actually going to try and put stuff in the actual bags in the bag. But I think people kind of think in terms of canvassing, and it is valuable because you can kind of give people time and let them talk, and that's valuable to set up those relationships. But on the other hand, you can sure make 100 times more voter contacts by just going to where people are.
What I'll add to that is, the concept of early voting is not like a currency. And the disruptions, especially during the census of, sometimes in a day, we were doing a daily live online forum during the entire pandemic. Sometimes in the day, a change would happen in whatever about voting. And so when people are confused, people don't do anything. They stop. Number one, that was, I believe, intentional as well. The other thing is the access to early voting. That is not a practice on the South Side because we haven't had early voting sites. And the core of the South Side, the experimental one at Mitchell Bank, at Mitchell Library, they did not give enough time for it to get rooted. Mm-hmm. They gave one cycle, and no one, when they do a startup, does a one cycle of, getting traction. So when you think of like strategically where it should be, and now they're like, oh, well, we're going to put this and my Lord, that's not what part of the Latino community of. I'm glad,
It was a terrible location.
And for events, mass events, it serves a purpose, but on a daily, and so, I don't know. I won't get into what I think is intentional. The point is, it's not there.
Yeah.
It's not where the people are. It's not where people feel comfortable going. It's not accessible. They haven't done it for a long enough time. And this is a currency that is not yet being exchanged in our community. The concept of early voting. Can I really do that? It's always changing. So I think that, it impedes it. The other thing is, in terms of you know, getting traction on the South Side, politics is a very taboo topic still in the Latino community, because remember, people are fleeing countries because, you know, of critical political danger. And that's still, and we're an immigrant community, all immigrants, not when we think of the South Side, but all immigrants, when you think about who's here. And people are still, like, we're finding people are still, you have to educate people on what discussions about nonpartisan democracy work is. And if you can tell them it's a nonpartisan discussion, it kind of eases it. But right away, when you talk about anything, people are going to think they have to disclose, you know, somebody in their house voted for Trump, like they're terrified to say my brother, you know what I mean? So there's still that, hey, we can talk about and, you know, step forward and say it's a nonpartisan discussion we're at, like a democracy discussion, not a political discussion. Because right away, people are like, they're trying to sell on
Right,
politics and.
right. Well, yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you, based on what you, the first thing you said, do you have any thoughts about what makes voting by mail versus voting early in person? What is more or less appealing about those two options for voters?
Well, I mean, but, I think everybody here would agree, like, it seems like voting by mail should be the win. But even myself, like, you get busy and it stays around, I'm gonna send it, and then, you know, and again, this is about currency. What are people used to doing, right? Nobody's taking pennies out anymore. So it's like, what is the currency? And how can we get these things to be currency? So we're still trying to crack that nut. I mean, I think the win is to convince people, like, all you have to do is matter. And we put a lot of efforts into, you know, absentee ballots, because we had the venue to the online forum. We don't have a daily online forum anymore. And so we're still trying to figure out how, and then everything, you know, everything you do takes time and effort and consistency to become, you know, a habit.
Can I ask something? I took students to vote this, I work with seniors, so I took them to vote this year, and I would say that they actually, most of my students don't know they can register online. That's not, they don't have, I mean, their access to it online is like, it's not being shared in what they were looking at, so they didn't actually know about it. And then one of them actually thought because he missed the deadline to vote online that he couldn't register. So I think that has to like go, like there has to be all the information presented at once, like,
And the upload.
yeah, like if you didn't do it this time, like you can still do it this time. And the other thing we went to Mitchell Street because like my students live all over, so we're all gonna go to this one place together. But the other thing I would say is access to like proof of address and IDs was really, I had students who couldn't vote because they couldn't get to the DMV in time because it was all this other work they had to do to get to the door to register in person. And I know there was one event I was aware of on the north side where they had like ability to get a photo ID at that event and register and all that stuff. So I think that would be really important for my students. I'll just speak for my very small group of students. Just because like you have to do that thinking backwards, like in order to do this, I have to get my ID, and even just information on how to acquire the free voting ID would be really helpful for them. Because they think they have to go to the DMV, which is, as we all know, none of us like to do it either. So that's just my observations. I found that, yeah, they really needed the one-on-one help that they got at Mitchell Street from the 5 really poll workers there. And we could all go together, and the poll workers all very supportive and like applauded them when they voted, and it was really beautiful. But yeah, but I guess I'll just say that, but don't assume that young people know stuff because it's online. I think being very explicit with the steps is where it's at. And most of them wanted to vote and they cared about the issues and they were passionate about it. It was just like so many steps that they had to go through. So as much as it can be simplified, that's all it just for my students.
One thing I want to share with you, one of our league members worked not through the league, but for an organization that was working to establish building cabinets. And once they were able to get a building cabinet, then that cabinet could circulate within the building and distribute literature. So that was one strategy that I'm interested in. I'm happy to share that with you. That was part of the technique to establish these building cabinets. And then I had a couple of questions for you. You know, the population census changes in population declines in the city. And I also, in the Mueller report and elsewhere, I read about the role of disinformation in, you know, sort of not partisan, but trying to stop people from voting. Like, what does it matter? Do you have any information about the declining population and disinformation?
Yeah, boy, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the census part of that. So you might have noticed that I was saying that the adult population has stayed the same over this period, but you know, the census numbers say the population has fallen. Well, when you look at the census count in 2010 versus 2020, essentially all of that decline was among kids. And you know, some people had like an initial level, wow, it's not accurate. And the great thing about figuring out how many kids there are is you can look at birth certificate data. So I got the birth certificate counts from the state for mothers who live in Milwaukee at the time of birth. And yeah, there's been like a 60,000 decline in the number of babies born during over that period. So yeah, the population is shrinking, but to date, that has happened at the young end of the population. It's going to work its way up to the adult population unless we start attracting lots of people here in a way that we can.
I wonder if that's true for the Latino population, because in the last census, what we had was in your south side, but you could attribute the growth in the area 100% to the growth of the Latino population. Now, I don't have yet the analysis of, did we see an exodus during the Trump years because of the anti-immigrant sentiment? And also we know that population of mixed households is going to be among the underrepresented ones.
Right, so yes, no, thanks for mentioning that. I was looking at, so you can get the number of births by zip code in the city. Is it 53215 is the big zip code that's on over by 35th Street?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You split that map that you saw in half, like 1504.
Yeah. So in 53215, that's historically been most babies in the city over there. And we see it really distinctly peak around 2014, quite quickly there. And at the same time, the census data did show like a diffusion of the Latino population in Milwaukee County, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone. But to put it specifically, I looked at how much of the growth in the Latino population happened in majority Latino census tracts versus census tracts where they're not a majority. And like essentially all the growth was in census tracts where Latino people were not a majority. So it really was this diffusion of the population into other parts of the city and into the suburbs. The census accuracy point, I think, is really important because, yeah, certainly I think we would expect people who, with good reason, have less trust with the government, less familiarity with it, participate less in the census. Of course, the Census Bureau, they will still try to count you even if you won't talk to them. They have ways of being like, well, we think this many people live in this building. And one way you can kind of try to get a handle on how accurate the census is in different places is looking at how many units the census says they found in that area, because those are easier to count than people. And the city, has this argument that the census undercounted us quite a bit, which I wrote very long and tedious look into. And I'm really selling it, aren't I? But they did this comparison using the really granular housing unit data that they've got, and they found housing unit undercounts in the census really only on the north side and not on the south side. In fact, they thought the census slightly overcounted housing units in a few places on the south side. All of which is to say, there's not like a big smoking gun, but I think it probably is true that there was some undercount there, although likely just as much of an undercount, I would think.
Information about this meeting.
Oh, sorry. I think, I don't think I have anything too intelligent to say about that, but yes, I'm concerned. And I think, I was really, I suspect what you said earlier is consistent with what I heard other people say about the changing rules. It's just the real discouraging thing to people. I don't know if you call that disinformation.
Well, that's more, I would put that more in the realm of voter suppression.
Yeah, yeah.
We have to jump through this, so
It's telling me.
One question, it's kind of a dreamer question. If you're at all knowledgeable about what other countries do you think voter turnout would be different if registration was automatic when you turn 18?
And it is in, see, it's the Oregon that has automatic voter registration now. You have to like explicitly opt out of it, I think they do.
most states have it.
Automatic. Or they have it where at the DMV they opt out.
Well,
But they don't have automatic, there are a few states with automatic.
so you,
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I mean, it for sure increases it. You can also do what Australia does, which is have mandatory finding if you don't.
Oh, it was Australia. I was thinking of.
3%, so you know, there's still people who are like, I'm gonna pay the fine for that. They're never gonna be honest.
And voter registration.
Mhm.
That was-
Mhm.
But it's just having the voter registration file something.
Yeah.
Falling off the register. Yeah.
I learned, maybe this is familiar to all of you, but I learned why Wisconsin still has same-day voter registration. I was surprised that that hadn't been taken off the books during the Walker administration. But it's because the Motor Voter Act from the early 90s.
that was the trade-off.
Yeah, it said that, so Motor Voter Act says that like anytime you interact with like the DMV, they have to offer a registered fee to vote. And that bill did not apply to you if at the time of its passage, you had same-day voter registration. And if you repeal same-day voter registration, motor voter goes into effect.
Same day, I think is actually more important, especially with the way we change the law every 5 minutes. A lot of times people think they're registered or not.
And there's a lot of people who don't, you know, get references in the city. And so,
Right.
yeah.
Well, going back to your point, the quote unquote free ID for voting, not what it sounds like. You don't need to drive, you can get it. You gotta get your kids to school and get to work, and you can't afford $40 for a California birth certificate and $40 for a Wisconsin driver's license. You're not gonna vote. That's the reality. So it's not, it's free, but then you can't drive anymore. It's a real, I don't have figures on how many people it affects. But I do know that the voter turnout went down when that law began to be enforced.
And I think also I was thinking about the Latino. I going back with the saying about the people who come to the different places. Actually, that's what affects probably the most because they don't trust the government. They don't trust the government over there. If they don't trust the government over here, because they don't know how they can affect anything. even though they are being here and they are, become citizens and, but I don't think that they, fully realize that, here, they have, I don't know, like, a little more, I don't know, say democracy, but, sometimes not quite.
No, I see.
But, yeah, that's the thing that probably affects the most,
Yeah.
because they think, what they are going to vote, if we actually my vote doesn't count. If of the government are gonna do whatever they want, either way, if I vote, I don't vote.
For those of you who have been working on the south side for a long time, have you seen changes in how much politicians like actually make an effort to appeal to voters there? Because, you know, that's a large part of people turn out. And politicians, I'm curious, are like candidates coming through on a more regular basis than they used to, doing events with Spanish language literature, anything like that?
They don't come.
No, you're right, they don't come.
They don't come. Not even, I remember the chief of police. I belong to another organization. One time we made a huge effort for the whole city to bring the chief plane. Or here to the south side, even though he was the chief police, Milwaukee for, I don't know how many years. He wasn't gonna come to the south side. But that day, yeah, because we gathered a lot of people from all over the city. That's why he came. Otherwise, we have to be kind of that area that you chose there, not including now the what is the area that, not the, yeah, but this one, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but, we have to think. And, yeah.
Yeah.
Because nobody came, I know, because I lived there for more than 30 years.
Right.
I know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I'm talking about, well, the rest of the people,
Yeah.
and most of the people who I knew when I came there, most of the people there. I'm still there. And that's why I say I feel sometimes that I am a second citizen. And different ways.
No, I would like to say too, though, that, most of the, they've had senators, police chiefs, candidates, because that is a large organization, and they come in and they present at their events. But as far as being, going to, these people vote for them, that, I don't know that people are going to neighborhoods for that,
Right.
but they do show up.
They want to do this in the economy.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair question that some of us ask. The Democratic Party had that big rally and, President Obama showed up it was in October, I guess. They had it at North Division High School. Where we at? Like,
1 minute.
it would have drawn a crowd no matter where the event had been. So why wasn't it on the south side? Why didn't they want to do outreach to the south side? I have no idea.
We have a lot of data on election day registration. And you say the south side lags the rest of the city in early voting, a day of higher election day registration for the rest of the city. Are there numbers on, same day registration for those who vote early, or are they lumped in? Together? That's what I'm interested in, Robin, because I wonder, you said one strategy is to spread the word on the south side that you can register when an early vote is. Too, I don't think it's that one day or nothing.
Sort of at your convenience, like that's probably. the
Yeah,
easiest way,
yeah.
Right, like.
I'm sorry, I have to.
I just want to ask you a question about, are the politicians showing up? They show up, like we do traditional candidates forums for municipal races. They show up for forums, they show up for major events, but, there are very few politicians that are not transactional. I mean, they get out for their races and you don't see them again. Like I lived in former Albany Donovan's district for 34 years. And he came to my house twice. And those were not positive interactions or different reasons. But the new candidates, either like, and then they're coming like during the day. So, it's become very transactional and I think it's a bad turn for politics when we have candidates who are becoming more and more transactional. It's not in their best interest either, so.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's really silly because they need to be building those relationships with people instead of being absent and coming out when they want to get elected. That's not a good deal for us, whether they're Latinos or not.
Thank everyone for being this evening, particularly when patients for having this dialogue with us. I think we've learned some good information. Some of it is positive, but perhaps more of it is troubling. And then I think that there's still a lot of questions. One of the things that I think that can support our effort is the continued dialogue amongst us who represent a variety of different organizations. Nick Ramos was here earlier, some boat riders, and just the synergy. I think we can support each other's efforts and will help, even navigate some of those, really tough issues that are before us this group. So, please feel free to, if John has a few more minutes to ask him any questions you might have, and just thank you again for coming.
Thank you, guys.